Hello and good morning. This is Kelsey from Kelsey Reads Things at Anna Porter Public Library in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And I am very excited to finally be discussing with you on this drizzly, rainy Wednesday morning, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by B.E. Schwab. Now, this is definitely a unique story. I have never read anything like it, but it does have the cadence and the feel of like a dark fairy tale that you may have been told many, many years ago. One that was probably passed down from multiple generations. That's at least the feel I got from this book. Doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It was definitely unique, but again, it did have this kind of cadence of a dark fairy tale. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is a dark adult fantasy. I, of course, cannot give age recommendations for books. I can only give you a general idea of rating. For instance, PG-13 or rated R. For this book, honestly, I would say it's probably maybe PG-13 and a little bit higher. There's nothing extremely explicit, I think, or too adult or advanced or necessarily intense. There are a few triggers, such as thoughts of suicide. There are a few sexual situations, however, there's not a lot of detail given, and there is the topic of prostitution brought up at one point. Other than that, I would probably rate this book as anywhere between PG-13 to maybe rated R, but that's just because of some of the content that is inside it. Reading level, again, I can't really give that a suggestion, but I think most young adults would be comfortable with reading this adult fantasy. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the plot of The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, but I'm going to make it a little bit fun. I'm going to include one of the major quotes from the book. "Never pray to the gods that answer after dark." This is the warning that Addie LaRue is given from basically the time that she can walk. She is our main protagonist. She is a young woman. When the story really starts for her, she is 23 years old. That's when one decision that she makes basically determines her entire life for the rest of her, I'm just going to say it, endless life. She becomes immortal. And she's told from as long as she can remember to never pray to the gods who answer after dark. However, in a moment of desperation, when she feels she has no other choice, Addie runs into the woods at 23 years old, runs away from a marriage she doesn't want, from kids that she does not want to be responsible for, and for a life chained to the small town she grew up in. And she prays and prays and prays for freedom. However, the God that answers, I'm sure you can imagine, is not going to exactly be benevolent. What she asks for is more than she could ever have bargained. And he takes the deal, but it comes with a price. Unfortunately, for the cost of freedom, Addie now has to walk the earth and not be remembered by anyone she encounters, including her family. And she is also not allowed to, she cannot physically leave a mark on the world. So basically, she has been set up to be forgotten, invisible by mortals. And that is the general premise of the beginning of the book. And it starts in the year 1714, or at least that's when the decision is made, in 1714. We do see a little bit of her childhood, but I'll go into that in a moment. So it starts when she's 23. In 1714, she makes that decision in a small town in France. And then eventually, where the story leads, she's in New York City. She goes into a bookstore that she's been in before. And of course, she doesn't expect anyone to remember her, but a young man at the counter says, "I remember you." Wow. That was so exciting to read about, and I will let you know that none of this is spoilers, because all of this is covered like in the very cover of the book. But if you're one of those people that wants to know things completely blind when you go on, maybe book reviews are not for you, because most book reviews will at least cover the general premise of the plot line. Okay, So that was the general idea. Addie makes an unfortunate deal. She has to walk all of eternity on Earth, not being forgotten, until one day she just happens to walk into the right bookstore where she is remembered by the first person in like 300 years. That's right, it's the year 2014 when she walks into this bookstore. This book was honestly one of my favorite reads of 2021. It was incredible, it was gripping, and I will say I listened to the audiobook version of this, so I can't really speak for the physical copy. I do have the physical copy and it's beautiful. The text that they used was really pretty, and I think it really fit the theme of the book. I will say the perspective and the setting, as well as the year, switches throughout the book. In fact, it even switches from Addie's point of view to another character's. So I would recommend, if you get confused easily and you need to physically see things, I do recommend reading the book. However, if you're pretty comfortable following along and have a general, feel generally confident enough to listen to it, the audiobook was fantastic. The narrator was one of the best I've ever experienced. So I highly recommend the audiobook as well. In general, I gave this book 5 stars. It was, as I said, amazing. Probably one of my absolute favorite reads of 2021, aside from A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. And if you're curious about that book, there's a video review of that as well on my YouTube channel. I believe I covered some of the triggers, and in case I haven't, a few of them include suicide, thoughts of suicide, sexual situations. However, there isn't really anything graphic, and prostitution is brought up as well. So now I would really like to talk about the things that I just loved about this novel and that I think make it stand out against other fantasy novels in this genre, this entire genre. It was unique. I mean, from page 1, I was spellbound into Addie's story. She was running, desperately trying to escape this reality that she didn't want to be in, this life that she had no interest in. From like childhood, she wanted to travel. She would go with her father to the market in France until she was about 12 every year, because she loved to travel and be around things that were happening in life. She wanted to be exposed to new things. However, in 1714 France, it's no longer considered appropriate for young women to travel anymore, apparently, with their fathers, unless they're married or they always have an escort. So as you can imagine, Addie is not very privy to that, and that is why she makes this deal. The pacing at times was a little bit slow, but overall the story was so compelling and so interesting, and I was just desperate to find out why this one kid just happened to be able to remember her. I had a general idea and a theory, and I was correct about that, but I am not going to give that away. You will just have to theorize for yourself once you read this book. And please feel free to talk to me about it. That's why I'm making these videos, because I love books so much and I only have a few people to actually talk to about them. So that's definitely part of the reason I do these. That, and I love to inform the community of the books that we have in the library and the opportunities that we have as well, such as resources and such. But that's not what I'm talking about today. Today I am talking about The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. So let me go back into things that I enjoyed about this book. As I mentioned, it was dark and also romantic. I was kind of expecting that, but as the story was progressing, I wasn't very sure. But yes, it is definitely very romantic in theme. I fell in love more than once with more than one character, so I have to say that all of the characters were very, very well thought out, and no one really felt two-dimensional at all. I was very, very happy with every single character that came onto the page that you were supposed to be happy with, that is. This story was very deep, and it made me consider all of the possibilities that are out there that the human mind hasn't even considered touching on, certain realms that we may never be able to enter, certain realities that we may never know anything about. That's just me. It kind of had an enemy to lovers trope, sort of. It's kind of hard to explain. You'll just need to read it, and that's all I'm going to say about it. The villains in this story. There was one really in particular, of course, and I don't know how to not love him. Like, there were times when his choices and his methods were definitely questionable. However, he's kind of one of those characters that you just love even though you're not supposed to. Or maybe you are. Maybe the author does want to make you love them. Sneaky, sneaky. The writing style was beautiful. There were times when it's usually from, like, not really Addie's, like, first person perspective. I'm pretty sure it was all told in, I can't remember if it was, that's really sad. I can't remember if it was first person or third person, but there were times when it was in Addie's perspective, and you could tell that the writing was changing because it went from, like, steady lines and cadence to poetry. There was a lot of poetry and prose in this book, and I've noticed that's kind of a theme for some of the books I've read this year. This is like the second or third book that has done that, where the main character is, you know, thinking in their mind or speaking, and then suddenly the writing style changes to poetry. And I think that's a really good way, a really interesting method of revealing what a character is feeling and who they are from, like, their deepest core. I thought that that was very important. It added a lot to the story, and I felt like doing that helped us understand Addie even more thoroughly. There was so much planning that went into this book and the plot line. You could significantly tell that the author spent a lot of time on developing this plot, and it really shows. This is actually my first V.E. Schwab book. I do have her Darker Shade of Magic series at home that I plan on reading this fall for spooky reads, but since I've read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, I'm just that much more convinced to read them as soon as that time comes. Another thing about the book is, as I mentioned, it's kind of haunting in a way. It's definitely dark, but it's a good thing. At the same time, it makes you think. You almost dwell on it afterwards, and not in a negative way, if that makes sense. Now I'm going to discuss some of the characters and get into a little more about them. Addie LaRue, of course, is our main protagonist. I instantly loved her. I think probably just for her drive for freedom, her drive for individuality, especially in a time when that was just not even necessarily possible for women in her position, or even just women in general. I could really relate to her because of that, in terms of societal expectations. I mean, we all have societal expectations regardless of sex, race, gender, preferences, all that. But because of that, because of her, just her extreme desire to have life and to experience things, I really related to her with that. She was very clever and smart and calculating, and you could see that as she was living her life, how she was developing. It was so cool to see that. Well, I guess to read that, or I guess listen to it, because I technically listened to the audiobook. I don't know. Regardless, it was very interesting to see that in a character and to really recognize and make note of their development. She was a true example of perseverance. She tackled all of her challenges above and beyond, and she really took ownership as well of the mistakes that she made and the choice that led her to the pathway that she's in now. She did take ownership of that eventually, and that is something I really admire in characters. Okay, so that's all on Addie. Next, I'm going to cover the villain, one of everyone's favorite character, nearly everyone's favorite character. He was just known as the Darkness. He is a villain you can't help but hate, and then love, and then hate again, and then love again. As I mentioned, he was very original. He kept me intrigued, but he also reminded me of past villains that I've read about. But again, he was very interesting. He definitely morphed himself to, like, the ideal man in Addie's mind, the ideal guy that she would, like, want to have any kind of romantic relationship with. She used to sketch this exact image in her notebooks. I think I forgot to mention Addie is an artist, and for some reason I always just immediately love characters that are artists. For example, Feyre Archeron, Clary Frey, and now Addie LaRue. I guess I just have a thing for artists in characters. I just like artistic characters. And he is very complex. The darkness, you can tell, I don't know. It's interesting. He had human-like emotions, feelings, and reactions, but at the same time, he was a god. He was almost above all that. It was very interesting, and you'll just have to read it for yourself to gain your own idea of who the darkness is and what he was all about, and if he was more human than Addie ever gave him credit for. Henry is me, and I am Henry. Henry is the young man that Addie meets at the bookstore who happens to recognize her, and I won't say a lot about Henry, but he is sensitive. He is sweet. He's the kid who just wants to be loved and to love in return. That is why I say Henry is me and I am Henry. I just want the world to be happy. I just want us to all get along and everyone to love each other, but that is not reality. And that is Henry. So I related to him on a very deep level. He is someone that you really can't help but love. So that is all I'm gonna say about Henry. And finally, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the secondary characters in terms of just covering characters. They were all original, fun, well written out. They were smart. No one was two-dimensional. They were very important to the overall storyline, and to be honest, they were just about as entertaining, if not more entertaining, than the main characters. So that was really well done. Finally, I'm going to talk about some unfun things, including just a couple of critiques that I had. The time, setting, and perspectives, as I mentioned before, changed frequently, and at times it was difficult to keep up with what was happening when. However, I will say for the most part, as the story was unfolding, most of the back and forth related to where the story was at that point. So there wasn't too much confusion, but again, if you pay attention better by actually reading rather than listening to books, I do recommend reading the book. The story did drag just a little bit in the middle, as stories tend to do, but it very quickly picked back up, and I wouldn't rate it any lower because of that. Finally, I want to say that this story was a 5-star read, in case I haven't covered that already. It was just incredible, really. It was very different, very unique. It kept me on my toes, and I loved nearly every moment of it. Alrighty, so that was my review of The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I very much enjoyed doing this video today with you, and I'm really excited to finally dive into The Mortal Instruments with you. I have read book 1 before. I'm probably just going to read a synopsis of it to recall a few of the things that I forgot, but I will be doing a book review of that with you next week. And then the following week, I will likely do the book review of the second book, which I just finished. I am now on the 3rd. And then I'm going to take a break from that series, and I'm going to dive into the prequel series, because apparently that is how you're supposed to read them. I will, of course, tell you guys about how that goes in the future. Thank you so much for watching today. I really appreciate all of my subscribers and my followers. You guys really make this worthwhile, and you make it fun. And I very much look forward to reviewing more books with you very soon. I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday. Bye-bye.